thing, semivowels and compression. Now, you, I think, already know that in my analysis of English vowels we have two systems, really, a strong vowel system, but also a weak vowel system. And the evidence for this is set out at point 1 on the handout. First of all, we have these sets of related words. Related words like anatomic and anatomy. Now, although the spelling is the same, the vowels are different. If we compare anatomic, adjective, with anatomy, noun, you see how the vowels change in accordance with the change of the stress pattern. So that we don't conveniently say anatom each time, but when we've got the stress on the first and third of the stem, we say anatomic, op, but with in the middle where the stress doesn't fall, anatomic. On the other hand, when we have the noun anatomy, where the stress is on the second syllable of the stem, we get a strong vowel in that syllable, and weak vowels in the other two. So we have this alternation between and between and the other way around, the same thing, depending on where the stress falls, and between and And it's this alternation that I refer to as weakening, where a strong vowel, or what might otherwise be a strong vowel, is changed to a weak vowel, typically, but not always, sure, when it doesn't have the stress. Similarly, if we compare the second example on your handout, democratic and democracy, you can see that there the first syllable has in democratic, but or some people use in democracy. The second syllable has in democracy, but in democratic. The third syllable has in democratic, but in democracy. In fact, many of these alternations arise, as in those examples, in fact, because of the influence of affixes. Many of the English suffixes, particularly those deriving from Greek or Latin, have effects on the stress placement. And these effects are not limited to stress, they bring with them changes in vowel quality. We've got a picture for the next example. There we have preside, the verb to preside, and president, the noun president. Now the president, of course, is someone who presides. Nevertheless, although the consonants stay the same in the stem, you can see that the vowels change. The first vowel is when it's stressed in president, but it weakens to or for some speakers, in preside. The second syllable of the stem is strong I, the diphthong, in preside, but weakens to or for some people, in president. So again, we see this relationship between the same stem with and without the suffix, the ending. Got some more examples of that to show you.
Right.
Been having fun with my new package. Here we have combine and combination. And again, you can see that the prefix is when it's unstressed, combine, but strong, when it's stressed, in this case by the alternating principle. There's a general rule in English that you can't have two weak syllables at the beginning of a word. Never happens. So that's why we get a strong syllable in the beginning of But the bind bit, strong in combine, weakens to be in combination. Combination, combine, combination. And down towards the bottom, we've got the examples: acclaim, acclamation. Again, you see the strong in acclamation because of the rhythmic principle that you can't have two weak vowels. but it weakens into a claim. The A of a claim weakens to in acclamation. And the last example on the screen at the moment, to refer, but the corresponding noun is reference. And again, you'll see the differences in the vowels as we switch the place of the stress. Here's some more. To repeat, the verb, but repetition, the noun. Notice the rhythmic principle forces the first syllable of repetition to be strong, and in these cases where you get these secondary stresses early in words with the prefix re, you regularly have re. So common foreigner's error is repetition, but it isn't re, it's re, repetition, just the same as in recommend. Represent, representation, but repeat, remember, reprove, retain, and so on. Next example, one of those verb-noun pairs that switches stress. Some do, some don't. Here we have the verb to record, and the noun, a record. Americans sometimes weaken the second vowel and say record, but on the whole in British English we don't. We keep a strong vowel always in the second syllable and say a record. And towards the bottom we've got phonetics and phonetician. This is an interesting example because we're not entirely agreed as to what the strong equivalent of the in phonetics is. There are people who say phonetician, others say phonetician, because both O and O can be strong vowels corresponding to both of them start with the letter O. So there's fluctuation here between two possibilities. Now, the first example here, vary, variation, and variety, shows weakening not to schwa, but to the E at the end of happy that we discussed the other day, the neutralization between E and I. Sheep and ship, distinct in stressed syllables, but in weak syllables we have E covering both of them. And that's what you have at the end of vary, word finally. That's what you have in variation before a vowel. But when it gets the stress through the effect of the ity suffix, t suffix, what happens? You get I for it, variety. Spelling, of course, fluctuates in a different way between the letters I and Y. There is some disagreement, some variation among speakers in just which vowels they weaken to. We've already discussed the problem of the vowel in happy and so on, but notice also in words like visibility. Now there is a now rather old-fashioned pronunciation, which I transcribed there with a line through it, which would be visibility. Visibility. Well, now we generally have this neutralization at the end, which might be E, visibility, intermediate things. But notice the other weak vowels. The strong vowels are I, but there's a general drift in English to change from I to in various positions within the word before a consonant. So that the older visibility is giving way gradually to visibility. Visibility. And both Gibson and I have recommended this form with the schwa as being more usual nowadays. It doesn't mean the old one has entirely disappeared, but it's no longer the mainstream form. talk now. On the handout, in one, we've covered related words and affixes. Now, variant pronunciations. There are quite a number of words where there are disagreements among speakers, or individual speakers are inconsistent, and the inconsistency concerns whether or not you weaken. So the names of the days of the week can be pronounced ending in day or weakened to D. So we can have Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or we can have Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. And most speakers, in fact, have both possibilities within their repertoire. The general advice I give is when this word is in a salient position, like when it has the nucleus at the end of a sentence, then use day. I'll do it on Monday. But otherwise, probably did. So I'll do it on Monday morning. Monday morning. Same applies with various names of months. You can say September or September. You can say November or November, where the weak vowel is optional in the unstressed syllable. A lot of place names are like this. This name, in race course, is traditionally called Ascot. But increasingly, one hears people pronouncing it Ascot, with a strong vowel in the second syllable. Both are possible, therefore, in a name like this. Yesterday afternoon, I was doing a radio phone-in, and somebody phoned in to complain about the way people pronounce the suburb of Birmingham from which he comes, because he wants to call that Edgbaston, with a in this middle syllable. Well, I must confess that I, like most people, call it Edgbaston, weakening to and he didn't like that, and he wanted to complain about it. So, with these proper names, there's often a difference between a local and a national pronunciation, which again concerns strong and weak vowels. Because, of course, the spelling doesn't indicate which it is. The last example of weakening is one that I hope is fairly familiar to you, the question of function words. All those little grammatical words that have a strong form and a weak form. The strong form has a strong vowel, the weak form has a weak vowel. So we have strong form can, I'll do it when I can, weak form can, I can do it tomorrow, can. Similarly, of, strong form of, weak form them, strong form them, weak form. In each case, it's a matter of switching between one of the strong vowels and one of the weak vowels. So, putting this together, point 2 on the handout, this gives us a system of 5 weak vowels as a kind of maximum nowadays, where we have, first of all, an E ranging over E, as in happy, radiate. Then an oo that ranges over up and oo, end of thank you, situation. Notice what happens to the adjective immune when we add a suffix that causes the stress to change. The verb from immune, meaning to make immune, is immunize. Now what happens to that oo vowel? It doesn't, on the whole, remain long. We don't say immunize. Sounds very strange. It's really much like the vowel of good for some people, immunize. But other people have it rather tenser than the vowel of good, immunize. It's really like the end of thank you. Others again may go all the way to schwa and say immunize, but I don't really feel that's a mainstream key for at the moment. So that's another place where you might get this neutralization. Ooh. Then the next weak vowel is one you know well about, the schwa, that's in common, better, and the beginning of allow. And there's another example of the general drift from I to on the screen. One pronunciation, tirelessness, with lessness, tirelessness. But another, and perhaps now the more usual one, is with tirelessness, tirelessness. Both are correct, but we seem to be gradually moving from one to the other. Tirelessness. I still remains the usual pronunciation in the plural ending, horses. After to sibilants, though there is a substantial minority who now use schwa there and say horses. Similarly with the rit prefix, related, there's a minority who say related. And I think the general trend clearly is towards getting rid of I as a weak vowel entirely. And I should think in 100 or 200 years we shall be like the Australians are already now, who have all their weak vowels, not I, but and say village and a ticket rather than a ticket, and horses as the plural of horse, related rather than related, so on, which is at least a much simpler system. The last weak vowel, the that I'm suggesting we can get in the second syllable of stimulus, again, is gradually changing to schwa. People often say stimulus. Executive changing to executive. The difference between these and immunize is you can't really have oo here. Immunize with a tense oo is fine, but stimulus is not, nor is executive. So that's why I distinguish this from the neutralized oo thing. It seems to me there is a difference, in fact, between stimulus and stimulate, because I expect or perhaps schwa in stimulus, but the neutralization oo thing in stimulate, and well, I suppose you can have stimulate, but it's very much more marked. Anyhow, that's very technical for those of you who are interested in the theory of weak vowels. Now, what I want to do next with the weak vowels is to bring it in to the consideration of syllabic consonants, point 3 on the handout. What is a syllabic consonant? Well, it's a consonant that is syllabic, a consonant that makes a syllable. Consider the word suddenly. Suddenly. You usually pronounce it suddenly. Suddenly. But how many syllables does it have? Suddenly. Not 2, it has 3. Suddenly. Suddenly. How can that be? Well, it's because the N is syllabic. Normally we think of syllables as depending on vowels. Wherever you have a vowel, there you have a syllable. Suddenly. That's fine, but we have another one. We have another vowel. Well, it's not a vowel, it's a syllabic consonant. Suddenly. And the whole thing is 3 syllables. Suddenly. Indeed, there is the possibility of pronouncing this word suddenly. Although that's not the most usual pronunciation, it is possible to say suddenly. So, what I'm suggesting is that syllabic consonants reflect an underlying or abstract sequence of schwa plus the consonant. So as I put it on the handout, schwa and n may make syllabic n, so that sudden becomes sudden. Schwa and l may make syllabic l, so that medal becomes medal. Schwa and m may make syllabic m, so that blossom becomes blossom. And lastly, schwa and r may make syllabic so that gathering becomes gathering. Now, these rules collectively I refer to as syllabic consonant formation. And although the general form of this rule is clear, it takes a schwa and a sonorant and produces a syllabic sonorant, the actual details of the environment are very complicated, partly stylistically related, and I don't really want to go into them now, but just let's notice, for example, that syllabic consonant formation in English is barred after a nasal, if we're talking about syllabic N. That is, in a word like common, you cannot make that into a syllabic N. You can't in English say common. You can in German, that's the difference between German and English, but you can't do it after sonorants, in fact, in general in English. So, again, if we have the word sullen, you can't in English say sullen instead of sullen. So that's one thing about this, that as far as syllabic end is concerned, it's barred after sonorants. Equally after a vowel, lion can't become line. We also tend not to do it after consonant clusters, so that London is usually London, not London, and Euston is usually Euston rather than Euston. But that's not an absolutely iron rule. Notice that there is no difference at all in pronunciation between the words spelt medal like that, and medal like that, verb to medal. They're both pronounced absolutely identically. Don't be misled by the spelling into thinking that there's some difference between them. Indeed, English people often find it very difficult to remember the correct spelling of the two words principal because they're pronounced identically. We're uncertain between the spellings, and people don't ask how to pronounce it, they ask how to spell it. Principle. Another example, idle, idle, both pronounced identically. All right, so syllabic consonants then are consonants which are unusual in that they function like vowels. They constitute a separate syllable. They have the extra length and sonority that we associate with vowels. Semivowels, conversely, can be thought of as vowels that function like consonants. Vowels, as I said so briefly and quickly and in such a gliding way, that they don't give you a syllable. So if we take the word yes, how many syllables does it have? One. Yes. Even though you can think of it as being a sort of little E and then an N and so. Yes. This E is non-syllabic and the whole thing therefore is one syllable. Why do I say they behave like consonants? Well, there's the phonetic fact of their being of short duration and not making a syllable, but there's also the way they behave when in the sentence. Yes, young, unit. Do we say a or an before them? Or do we say a young man, a young man? Do we say a unit, a unit? We don't say an. Why don't we say an unit? Why do we say a unit, not an unit? Well, because we go by the pronunciation. Well, unit is spelt with a vowel letter. The pronunciation involves a semivowel before the vowel at the beginning. Semivowels function as consonants, and therefore you get the preconsonantal form of the article. A unit. Those of you who have Spanish as your mother tongue, or Swedish, or certain other languages, must be careful to distinguish the semivowel y from j, the affricate. Difference between use, employment, and juice, squeezed from a fruit. Have you any juice for me, and have you any use for me, are different messages. Well, y is like a quick E, similarly w is like a quick oo. Wet. This is useful, you see, if you want to teach it to somebody who finds this a difficult sound. You could start by, if you want to say wet, you can start by saying wet, 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 and then you shorten this, wet, 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 until it's really short. And for people who have problems distinguishing V and W, want to say vet instead or something like that, this is perhaps a useful technique. Similarly, for those who have problems with yes, you can say Jess instead of yes. Think of it as yes, 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 and make that shorter and shorter without making it fricative. Yes, wet. Wash, one. And And again, you will notice that the article before a word like wall, we don't say an wall, we say a wall, because W behaves as a consonant. Equally, you don't get linking R before J and W. We say your unit, not your unit. We say your way, not your way. Because although they might be thought of as like vowels in their manner of formation, nevertheless, they function as consonants. So we've seen that the distinction between vowels and consonants in English is complicated by the fact that certain phonetic consonants behave like vowels, namely syllabic consonants, and certain phonetic vowels behave like consonants, namely the semivowels. So we have to be clear whether we're talking about articulation or about linguistic function, because we get a different classification depending on what we do. Let's move on now to the question of compression. Compression is the process whereby we reduce the number of syllables in a word or in a sentence by switching from a sound that is syllabic to a sound that is non-syllabic. So this may mean, I've seen a mistake on the board. I only did it this morning. These are the wrong way around. Let's see if we can correct it. Cross that out. We start with a syllabic sound, an I, U, N, U, and we make it non-syllabic. A consonant, J, W, N, L, and R. This is set out at 5 on the handout. It's the same really as what was on the board. Sorry about that mistake. Let's look at the first example, the word lenient. If you ask how many syllables are there in lenient, it's a difficult question to answer, because we can say it as a 3-syllable word. Lenient. Thumpty, lenient, lenient. But equally, we can say it as a 2-syllable word. Lenient, lenient. And it's not really sensible to ask which is correct. Both are correct. On the whole, it seems to me that we tend to say these words in their full, uncompressed form if they're unfamiliar, if we're using them for the first time in a discourse, if we're speaking particularly slowly and clearly, deliberately, as we say. Whereas, if it's a word we've just used before, or if it's a very familiar word, or if we're talking casually, we're more likely to compress them. Second example, U becoming what? Influence. We can say this as 3 syllables, influence, tumtity. Or we can say it as 2 syllables, influence, tumtity, influence. And both are possible. Someone who's in prison might be a prisoner. Prisoner, 3 syllables. But they can also be a prisoner, 2 syllables, prisoner. From the verb, I seem to have made a further mistake here, don't I? It shows what happens if you do things in the early morning when you're not thinking clearly. Change the example from bottling to rattling, halfway through. From the verb to bottle or the verb to rattle, we get an ing form simply by adding ing, rattling, bottling, but we can then compress it, giving us rattling, a rattling good story, bottling, a bottling plant. And the last example, from preference, bisyllabic consonant formation, we get preference, preference, 3 syllables still, that can then compress into preference, 2 syllables. Now, this is a real live process in many words, inasmuch as poets, nursery rhymes, can scan these words either in a longer or in a shorter form. in our national anthem, God Save the Queen, we have two lines that go, Centre victorious, happy and glorious. And you can see that glorious is there treated as three syllables, and you've got a separate note for the I and the Glorious. There's another well-known hymn people sing in church, which begins, Glorious things of thee are spoken, Zion, city of our God. Well, it has to be scanned as two syllables. Glorious things of thee are spoken. Glorious has to be compressed or it won't fit the music. And if you look at English poetry for 500 years back, you can find many, many examples of these words which are sometimes treated in a longer form, sometimes in a shorter form, depending on whether or not you choose to compress them. Notice this constraint that I mentioned at the top, that the second vowel, the vowel after the one that loses its syllabicity, has to be weak. This happens before weak vowels, the in lenient, the in inference, the in prisoner, the I in rattling, and the in preference. Notice that there's a difference between, for example, radiant and to radiate. Radiant is compressible because it's got here, a weak vowel, radiant. You can compress to radiant. To radiate, on the other hand, is not compressible. It has to stay as three syllables because A at that point is strong, radiate. So you can't say radiate, you have to say radiate. Radiate, but radiant you can compress. The word radio, by the way, is a little bit odd. Radio is a very familiar word, and O is a rather marginal sort of vowel. It sometimes really behaves like a weak vowel. And so you do sometimes hear the word radio said with compression, but that's a special case. The consequences of this restriction to weak vowel as a context for compression is seen very clearly when we compare the verb ending ate with the noun or adjective ending spelled ate. The verb is to separate. A is strong, to separate. The adjective is separate or separate. Some people have the weak vowel I, separate or separate. But you'll notice that we have a weak vowel at that point. Therefore, we can compress before it, and we get the loss of a syllable, so that separate is usually in fact said as two syllables. But the verb to separate has to be three syllables. Just the same thing in the example at the bottom. To moderate, verbs in ATE have a strong vowel. To moderate. The adjective, most adjectives in ATE have a weak vowel. Moderate, which is therefore compressible into moderate. So that's the relationship between vowel weakening and compression. Compression also applies within the sentence. If we have the particular sequence that we're concerned about, it's got to be a weak neutralized E or U or a syllabic consonant and followed by a weak vowel. So, if you say, tell me a story, that can compress into, tell me a story, tell me a story. if we had tell me everything, could that compress?
No.
No. Because E is strong, and you can't say tell me everything. That's a Spanish type error. You can do that kind of thing in Spanish. Bañarla, or bañarla, okay? Bañarla. Not in English. Tell me everything, no. Tell me everything has to remain syllabic, because this is a strong vowel. But tell me again, tell me a story, tell me another, those can compress. Tell me another. About to arrive. There we've got to before a weak vowel again, and that can compress into about to arrive, about to arrive, about to arrive, about to arrive. If you say that's what I was about to ask, can we compress and say about to ask? No, we can't, because R is a strong vowel then, and you don't get compression before a strong vowel, only before a weak vowel. About to arrive, about to explode, about to announce, but about to ask, about to enter, about to offer something. Then there's an example involving syllabic N, optionally compressing, so out and about, out and about, syllabic consonant formation gives us syllabic N, and this then is compressible, giving us out and about, to go out and about. Out and about. If it were out and in, could you compress that?
No.
No. Because in would there be a strong I, and you don't compress before a strong vowel. Out and in has to remain syllabic and. But in out and about, and can be reduced just to a non-syllabic N consonant. All right, this compression process then is a very much a live one that we can make choices about whether to do or whether not to do. But there are many words where what was historically a process of compression has in general become more or less fixed. Consider the word several. Well, now, what is the word? What is it? Is it basically several? Well, perhaps it is. Syllabic consonant formation gives you several. Compression then changes this into several. Now, I think what we mostly say is several. And I suspect there are many speakers who have no other possible pronunciation than several, who don't have the option of several left anymore. Because if one always says it in the compressed form, and it's a very common word, that's what happens. An even clearer example is the word that must once have been every. Because nowadays the pronunciation every seems very artificial. Syllabic consonant formation, compression, and normal pronunciation nowadays is every day, everyone. But I think it arose from a historical compression. We can say that the compression has been lexicalized, it's been incorporated into the lexicon. I think speakers may vary a good deal about this. When I introspect, it seems to me that I have a categorical compression in camera. I have to say camera as two syllables. I can't really, in my own English, pronounce it as camera, although I know some people do say camera, and historically that's clearly what it was. Factory, I think, has to be basically two syllables for me. Factory, although there may be people who say factory, but I'm not one. So it's like some of the assimilations and elisions. It's difficult to distinguish the historical from the symbolic. Here's some more examples from connected speech. Syllabic L, a couple of minutes. And syllabicity before the weak L, give you a couple of minutes, a couple of minutes, a couple of minutes. And at the bottom, there's a whole chain of derivation. Look what happens here. we start off with a neighbour of ours. A neighbour of ours, well, linking R, a neighbour of ours. Schwa plus R, syllabic consonant formation into syllabic R. A neighbour of ours, a neighbour of ours. This is a compression environment, syllabic R before a weak vowel. Means the R can lose its syllabicity, giving a neighbour of ours. A neighbour of ours. I was talking to a neighbour of ours the other day. Well, from the point of the EFL learner, this may seem a great luxury. You don't need to bother with these things. But I think it's useful to know about it, again, from the point of view of understanding what's going on. Anyhow, it's interesting. Now, the last little topic I want to look at with you is the topic of smoothing. This is related to compression, but it isn't quite the same. Finished? Smoothing is the process whereby a diphthong may lose its second element when it's followed by another vowel. So this happens in the word fire, where we have the diphthong I followed by another vowel In its full form, fire has two syllables. Fire. Fire. But this diphthong can, through the optional process of smoothing, weaken or lose its second element, so that you just get a long fairly long there, and say fire, 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 fire. The resultant sequence can then, of course, be compressed into one syllable, giving us far with a straight diphthong, far, far. It's this one, far. Or it may even become monophthongal, far, far. So you can get any of those possibilities. In general, if the word is in a salient position, it's more likely to be said in its full form. I'm going to throw it in the fire. And the more it's in the middle of a sentence, lost somewhere, perhaps unstressed, then it's more likely to be smoothed and or compressed. Put it on the bonfire. Bonfire. Well, this sequence of events applies equally to ow before another vowel, so that power, the ow can lose its second element, giving us power, and that can then compress into a single syllable, pa, pa. You don't need to do this. Those who learn English don't need to imitate this, but you really must know about it, otherwise you may find it difficult to understand certain things. If someone says they're studying on a science course, science, you've got to be able to interpret science to mean science. If you ask where University College is and you're told it's in Gower Street, you've got to be able to recover from Gower Street. So just from the practical point of view of comprehension, I think it's useful to know about smoothing. There's some more examples on the handout. Try again can become try again. If at first you don't succeed, try, try, try again. How about that can become how about that? How about that? Nowadays can become nowadays. It's not only I and ow, but other diphthongs as well. Player can become player. Player. To stay around can become to stay around. To stay around, but don't start hearing stare or stir there. It means stay around. Smooth to stay around. Going going, going, gone. Well, it doesn't always have to be all there. If you smooth the O of going, I'm going away. I'm going away. You don't necessarily see the lips round for the O. It doesn't have to be going. It can be going, going, going. I'm going away. When we have E or U before another vowel, they sometimes undergo smoothing of a slightly different type. What happens to them is they tend to become like the corresponding short vowel, so that U changes to U. So that from to do, we get an ing form which is doing, but that can be said as doing. Doing, doing, and that can be compressed into a single syllable doing. Agreeable can become agreeable. Museum can become museum. Theological can become theological. Being can become being. Through it can become through it. Ruin can become ruin. Some people list ui as a sort of special extra optional diphthong in English. Well, it just arises automatically through the process of smoothing and compression. You can see now why it's so difficult for many foreign learners to distinguish clearly between being and being, which of course represent different tenses. It's being analysed. It's been analysed. Which was which? It's being analysed. That's this one. Now, being, this is a place where you can get smoothing. So you can get being. The whole thing can sort of compress phonetically into a long e, being, being. Being has two possible pronunciations. Some people say been, some say been. Some people have a strong form, weak form relationship between them, others don't. You can have them both as a strong form. Americans typically have been as their strong form. Well now, if your mother tongue happened to be Spanish or Japanese, both of which give you problems with hearing final ng versus n, you can see how it's very easy to get confused about these. If I tell you furthermore that there is an alternative pronunciation in not quite RP that involves an in rather than an ing, running, shooting instead of running, shooting, you can see how they become even more similar. I don't know that anybody's done any actual tests, but I still think that probably native speakers will usually get this right and will hear the difference between it's being written and it's been written. But I know it's very difficult if you're not a native speaker to get the difference. It's being written, sorry, right first time. It's being written, that's is. It is being written. It's being written. It has been written. See if you can say whether this is or has. It's being written. Is. It's been written. Has. It's been written. Has. It's been written. Has. It's being written. Is. You can also see why I am convinced that many foreign learners who think they understand what is being said nevertheless evoke from native English speakers, he doesn't understand half of what I say. He doesn't quite get it. He gets bits of it but not other bits. You may be missing rather important tense distinctions like the difference between is being and has been. Well, studying the phonetics, I hope, will help to at least make it clear what the issues are and what you have to listen for in order to overcome that kind of problem. Thank you so much.